And I'm working with a colleague in Denmark at the moment, Marianne Hedegaard, to think about how we work carefully, and we're spelling that word care, C-A-R-E, F-U-L-L-Y, carefully with children and young people and other professionals in order to support them when they face developmental crises in their lives, and transitions are obviously one of those. So I'm coming at it from a kind of broader angle, not simply from looking only at young children and young people in care. Now, what I'm hoping is that my slide is going to move, which it doesn't seem to be. Let me see.
Please use the button, the arrow at the bottom of your screen on the left.
Yeah, I know, but it's not there.
Yeah, just hover your, yeah, okay.
Lovely, thank you. Yes. Okay, so, but I have been involved in the Rees Centre, which is located in the Department of Education, University of Oxford, which is where I was before I retired. And I was associate member of the Rees Centre. And the Rees Centre, I know some of you are very familiar with it. It focuses on fostering and care more generally, children in public care more generally, and education and the links between them. When I was involved in helping set it up, I was so aware that the practitioners that we brought to meetings talked constantly about the need to work on relationship building when children and young people came into new care settings, and how important the first few days were. And there was very little research on it. I'm going to come back to the need for more research on this as my talk proceeds, but I really just want to alert those of you who are not familiar with the Rees Centre at the Department of Education, University of Oxford. Very easy to find, and it is full of most wonderful resources that my colleagues have created. So please go to the website and follow up some ideas. What I want to talk about today is primarily focus on the challenges of transitions for children and young people. I want to talk quite a bit about building relationships in transitions in care, and focus on what I'm calling and other people call developmental transitions, and contrast them with detrimental transitions, and then finish with a focus on implications for practice. And I need to say at this point, and I think it was mentioned in Karen's introduction, that I work within the cultural historical psychology tradition. And that sounds as if it's very backward looking. It's actually very forward looking. We're constantly trying out ideas in relation to practice and fashioning our ideas so that they are useful in practice. But we're drawing on the initial ideas of Lev Vygotsky, who was working in the 1920s and 1930s, early 1930s in Russia. And I'm going to be taking quite a theoretical lens on the work that I'm going to be talking about, and taking for granted, I'm afraid, that there's this constant move between theory and practice, and theory is only as good as it is useful for practice, and that's really my starting point. But I asked if I could go first because I did want to focus quite a bit on the theory. So what did Vygotsky say about child development? First of all, I have to tell you that that delightful 3-year-old is my granddaughter Liv, and she's now 15 and diligently working for her exams at the moment. But just have a look at that child. Her parents are they would both say they were creatives. They're involved in the film industry. And here she is, she's sitting on a plastic chair with a huge piece of paper. She's got one brush in her hand, but there are other brushes she could use. She's got an array of paints. She is making marks. I mean, she's 3, she's doing mark making. The table is an old table. It doesn't need extra protection. And she's already thinking and working out what color paint she's going to use next. So the environment that we adults create for the unfolding of children and young people's agency, their capacity to propel themselves forward as learners, is going to be one of the themes that's going to be running through what I'm talking about. So the Vygotskian view of child development is that learning precedes development. So not like Piaget, where development just unfolds in some kind of, not being fair to Piaget really, but there's an unfolding of maturity. Vygotsky said, actually the adults around the child or young person are important. But at the same time, the young person needs to propel herself forward by drawing on the resources that are available and are made available to them, and they are in control of their own learning. So the adult's important, but the agency of the child or young person is also absolutely crucial. And the adult's role is to provide resources, which will include support, taking the child seriously, finding things that they can do well, to encourage the unfolding of a child's agency. Now, as a child moves between settings and meets new demands, she can experience what Vygotsky called crises. And when I first read about crises, I thought it was a sort of a bit of a dramatic term. And actually what he meant by it was that people have to, learners need to orientate themselves to what is important in the new setting that they go to. So when you move from preschool to formal schooling, you're orienting away from a focus on play to a focus on these are certain things you need to do, and particularly literacy and numeracy. So these transitions and crises are not necessarily detrimental. They can be springboards for development. And so the key question today is, how can we ensure that the transitions that young people going into care and out of care, and Marie's going to talk more about going out of care, the key question is, how can we ensure that these transitions are developmental and not detrimental? So that's one of the things I want to keep going as well. So adult important, agency, and transitions as springboards. And let's think positively about those transitions. And another key concept that arose as part of the development of Vygotsky's ideas comes from the work of my good friend Marianne Hedegaard in Copenhagen. And the notion of motive orientation. And again, this is going to be important in what I'm talking about in the future. Motive orientation it really relates to what do we see as important in the phenomena that we're engaging with. So children, as they move between settings, need to orient themselves to what's important in those settings, and they will need help to do that. So children, this is just taking from a special issue that we put in Learning Culture and Social Interaction series. Children may acquire new motives as they anticipate or enter a new practice. And these new motives may be contradictory to earlier leading motives. And the child's motive orientation and competencies have to be restructured. Now, if we think about the situation for some young children, young people in care, and they're going from placement to placement to placement, this is putting a lot of demand on them in terms of orienting to what's important in this family or in this care setting as they move from placement to placement. So motive orientation is going to be a key concept, and I'll keep coming back to that. So transitions are difficult, even though they have a lot of potential in them. So motive orientation, we orient towards what we see as important. When we move from one setting or practice to another, we need to orient to what's important in that new setting. And actually, this is good in many ways, because this is how we learn and develop. We see new demands in practices, and we learn how to, with help, hopefully, how to respond to them, and we learn. So maturity has a part in it, but we are also learning because we're responding to new demands. But, and this is where it becomes problematic for children who are in care, is they've got to constantly work out what's important in the new care setting. And it's not enough, and this is what the practitioners were telling me, it's not enough to say, this is what we do here. We need to be able to do more than that. So motive orientation is, I think, a useful concept because it tells us that two people can look at the same thing or event like an evening meal and orient to different aspects of it. So they see different things in it and they are motivated to engage in it for different reasons. So a young child or teenager coming into a placement might actually think, oh, evening meal, heavy food makes me feel nervous. I am seizing up inside. I just don't want to engage with this. Makes me feel nauseous. Where for the foster carer, perhaps, sitting and talking about the day at the end over a meal is actually very important for family bonding and finding out what's going on. So you can look at the same thing like an evening meal and have very, very different reactions to it. And I'm going to be arguing that we need to understand those motive orientations in order to help the young person adapt to the new demands in the new practice. So children and young people may need help in reorienting to what matters in the new setting, and the setting may need to adjust. And again, we'll pick this up. And there are lots of children and young people go through so many transitions from home to preschool, preschool to school, onto high school, onto work. So there's all of those going on, but children in care will find themselves having other transitions as well, which might also involve going to new schools. And then particularly for adolescents, you've got sexual development, all the work that goes on among adolescents about creating an identity. What kind of person am I going to be? Trying out new persona and new identities, thinking about shaping their futures. For adolescents in particular, this is a desperately turbulent time without the movement between different placements. So I just want to point you in the direction, if you don't already know this work, of a researcher, again within the cultural historical psychology tradition, King Beach. I haven't seen King for about 10 years, but every time I saw him up to then, I kept saying, please write more, because what he writes is absolutely superb, but it's mainly in the area of maths education, which means a lot of people don't get to it. But what he's, two key concepts that came out of his work when he was thinking about identity, moving across practices and change. One is this concept of developmental coupling, and I'll explain that in a moment. But what he really means is that the person and the environment, the practice they're in, need to adapt to each other. It's not simply the child or the young person adapting to the environment. The environment itself also needs to make some movements. And he also argued that most transitions are consequential. And again, that's coming out of that optimistic Vygotskian view that transitions and crises are springboards for development. And so transitions are likely to be consequential and involve some development, or the possibility for some development for the person making the transition. Which leaves us with thinking then, when a child enters a new placement, the extent to which the child responds, the extent to which the new placement, the new setting, the family or the care home responds to the child is important. And it's important that developmental coupling happens, that mutual response to the agency, the potential agency of the child. So a little bit more on consequential transitions, again coming from King Beach. I should have said he's a US researcher. Consequential transitions involve a change in the relationship between a person and the activities or the practices in which they engage. So they're consequences for the purpose, for the person, and for the activity or the practice. So that's what he means by consequential. And he's constantly thinking about the need for those transitions to be developmental rather than detrimental. And he talked about 4 types of consequential transitions that make a difference, so the person moves on and learns. And we don't need to remember all of these, but he talked about what he called lateral transitions, which would be the kind of normal transitions that are slightly problematic, but not desperately. So moving from elementary school to high school, for example. And everybody's doing it, and it's expected. Collateral transitions can be deeply problematic, particularly for children from minority cultures. So that means that the child is working, say, with the school environment and the school sets of practices and what they see as important, and learning to orientate to that. At the same time, the family cultures might be quite different. And so the child is inhabiting 2 sets of practices, and the transitions are, and they're holding those two, the transitions between the two in quite challenging ways. Then there's encompassing transition, when everything around you changes and everybody is having to deal with the change. And then the final one is mediational transition, which is where we need to give particular support to the person making the transition in order to help them see things, and he doesn't use the term motive orientation, but to learn how to orient to what's important in that new set of practices. And I think, we could have a long debate about those 4 sets of transitions. I think that we probably would, I suspect King Beach might want to develop them too now. But moving into a new care setting sounds as if it might be a straightforward lateral transition. And that's what the practitioners were saying in the meetings at the Rees Centre. I mean, but not necessarily using that language, but we're saying we underestimate what's involved in those transitions into new care settings. So I think it's closer to the notion of a mediational transition, where specific help is needed. And I'm going to keep with that term mediation, and again we'll bring that up a bit later on. So mediation can assist with developmental coupling, can assist with that mutual accommodation of the person and the environment that they're in. So in thinking about this session, I obviously went to the wonderful Rees website, and looked at this international systematic review, which was done by 3 of my former colleagues there, about educational outcomes for children who have been in care. And it was a review of research up to 2015. And we all know that children in care are more likely to be unemployed, have mental health problems, lag behind in educational outcomes. And I was listening to a talk only last week about how many young women go straight from care to prison, which is frightening and awful. But being in care is not necessarily detrimental, according to this systematic review. And what they emphasized was caregivers' sensitivity and attunement and developing relationships with caregivers and friends, all the things that go with being resilient, frankly, is very important for that move into care and the support people get in care. And then they go on to say something that's really interesting. Developing relationships help caregivers to understand the causes of a child's behavior. And I think we need to, this why question, why are you reacting this way? Or why is this important for me? Is something that we need to bring very much to the surface. And they conclude then, without going into any depth about it, because they're just looking at existing research, relationships can mediate the transitions, and we need to place children's relationships at the heart of all we do and listen to and empower the child or young person. And I'm sure everybody would utterly agree with that, but I'm going to be arguing we need to unpack what we mean by relationships in this context. And another very nice piece of research that I've read fairly recently was by Ruth Chambers and her colleagues, a US study. And it really allowed me to pick up on Melanie Jensen's nice presentation, where she was saying, you know, yes, friendliness is really important, but she went on to unpack what's involved in that and talked about hosting and what's involved in doing that. And I would utterly agree, it's not just about friendliness. So what Chambers and her colleagues did was elicited, probably a lot of you familiar with this piece, elicited advice from foster care alumni, people who've gone through the system, and asked them what advice would they give to children, foster carers and professionals involved in placements. And their suggestions really resonated for me in my concern with young children's agency and their capacity to be in control of their own trajectories. Involve children and young people in placement decisions. Children should hang on in there, so there's a certain amount of resilience and toughness needed. And children should not get too attached because of the concern about loss and trauma, which they talked a lot about. Give children time to orient towards what is expected and help them feel safe when expressing emotions. And their summing up statement was, it's about, and this is a quote again from one of the alumna, it's about establishing a bond, a relational bond of trust with the child. And that's what I'm hoping to unpack a little bit. But the key issues I took from this really nice paper was the importance of the agency of the child, the emotional aspects of transitions into new placements, trauma, and so on, and loss. And Vygotsky was very, very clear about how emotion plays into learning and development. And for me, the very interesting thing I took away from it was the dimensions of care. Being a foster carer or being involved in running a care setting, or being a social work practitioner involved in placing children in care, this need for some kind of professional distance as well as love. And I thought I was so interested in the advice that children should not get too attached, because I've been advocating this need for both love and care at the same time as a degree of professional distance in order to enable the child or young person to move forward and take control over their own lives and not be dependent on you as the caring professional. And then this relational bond of trust seemed to me to be a key to thinking about what's involved in developmental coupling. So I'm now going to go into some of the ideas that have come out of my research and ask you to think about them in terms of movements into care and into new care placements. But first of all, I'm going to mention my absolute favorite philosopher, good Canadian, Charles Taylor. And he's been influencing me ever since I did my master's degree. And I'm summarizing him slightly here, but it's very relevant, I think, for thinking about the need to be an agentic person in control of your own trajectory, and how care settings can help with that. And he said in a chapter he wrote a long time ago, we are agentic to the extent that we not only set our goals, but also to the extent that we can evaluate whether we've reached them. And I think that fits, that goes back to the Chambers argument: involve children and young people in placement decisions and help them be part of the problem solving that's involved in that kind of setting. So all the time, the agency of the child and young person is absolutely crucial. So I'm going to take you through these three concepts, but I'll give you a little bit of background to them. For the last now 25 years, probably slightly longer, I've been examining how successful practitioners collaborate with each other to support children, and also how they work with children and young people and with adults in order to support them. And why I started doing this was because I could see that some practitioners are absolutely brilliant at doing this. And I thought if I could label what they were doing and test the concepts that I was labeling, but if I could label what they were doing, then we could start to think about how that gets taken into training programs, for example. And I'm pleased to say that actually these ideas have gone into a program at Oslo Metropolitan University, for example, with multidisciplinary an area of professional training that is multi-professional, and they've used these concepts as a way of thinking about it. It's also been involved in a couple of other areas to at least to stimulate thinking about interprofessional training. It's not happened in the UK, but I don't think I want to get in. So the concepts are relational expertise, which is an additional form of expertise, which is over and above the expertise you might have as a social worker, for example, or a mental health worker. And it's the capacity to elicit the motive orientations of each other. So in the case of the child, what's the child orienting to when she comes into this setting? And also to be very clear about what matters to you and what motivates you in relation to a particular problem or a particular setting. So it's about being very explicit about the whys of your, you might want to say, attitudes or feelings or motivations. And I used to talk about it in terms of what matters rather than motive orientation. I think it's quite interchangeable. Now, knowledge of each other's motive orientations or what matters to each other in this particular problem setting can create a resource which I'm calling common knowledge, and it's knowledge of each other's motive orientations. And building common knowledge takes time, and we'll talk about that in a moment, how we go about building common knowledge. And common knowledge then mediates the third of the three relational concepts, relational agency, the unfolding of the agency of the child. And if we're talking about working with clients, whether they're children or young people or adults, what we're doing as professionals is helping them move forward together and then gradually withdrawing our support so that they can then move on and work agentically without our support. So the relationality is important in the beginning, but the end point is that they will work agentically themselves. We can think about it also in terms of interprofessional collaboration. And in that case, it's more a question of, well, this needs to be done first, and so I'll hang back, and so you can be agentic now, in order to get things sorted, but then you'll move back so I can go forward. So it's more of a way of thinking about how do we collaborate together in a strategic way in order to work on a problem. But I'm going to be mainly focusing on the first bit, which is really about how are children and young people supported agentically through thinking about these three concepts. Now, I think that these three concepts are quite useful to know as if we're involved in giving advice to or training carers, foster carers, that these are things that they can really be thinking about in relation to a whole range, a whole myriad of different problem settings. So I'm going to give you some examples of what that might look like in practice. And they are very trivial examples and they are fictional examples. And I've done that primarily because I didn't want to get into complicated case histories and so on, and just give some very, very simple examples. And when we look at them, I'm going to be asking you to sort of remember that the notions of developmental coupling, consequential transitions, and developmental transitions, and the ideas of those transitions allowing for the unfolding of the young person's agency. And this is where I show how absolutely useless I am at doing presentations. But here we have a problem. So, very schematic, I apologize now. But there's a problem space here. It's the evening meal in the house, and Jenny is a teenager and she's arrived there, and it's seen as very important in the house that she gets involved in sitting at the dining table in the evening at 6 o'clock, talking about the events over the meal. So the problem space is what needs to be worked on. And the intended outcomes are that she feels respected and valued as a member of the family and can join in and contribute to the family. But first meal, she looks visibly uneasy, doesn't want to eat, doesn't join in the conversation, and rushes away from the table as fast as she can. And later it's discovered that she's taken some biscuits from the kitchen and she's sitting in her bedroom and she's hungry, but she's just eating biscuits because the whole social thing and food eating with people is something she cannot cope with. So that's the problem space. Now, if we have a look at the foster carer, what she wants to do is to include the young person in family life. So when she looks at the evening meal, she sees it in terms of, well, of course she's got to come and join in and be included in family life. Whereas Jenny, the young person, I feel very nervous about food. So there's a real need here to build common knowledge. Now, how is common knowledge built in those circumstances? I said these are fictional cases, but these ideas have been used by a number of people who have been looking at how we work with vulnerable children and young people. And so the kinds of things that I'm going to talk about now are things that have been done, but in different settings. So what needs to happen is they need to build a mutual understanding of each other's motives. They need to build, they understand what matters to each other in relation to the meal. And they need to build common knowledge slowly over time. And this is where the foster carer has to really take the lead on this, exercise relational expertise, and listen to the child. So the examples that have come from other settings have been very much about working alongside the more vulnerable person. So in this case, it would be respecting the child's history, talking about what matters to them and in relation to their feelings about food, being clear about why eating together is important for you. And that might happen over preparing food, setting the table together, doing a lot of listening, huge amount of listening, and very importantly, taking the child's accounts very seriously. And the common knowledge that is then built can mediate how the carer and the child act together over dinner. Now, again, I do apologize, it's so fictional, but so you might have, the carer might say things like, oh, Jenny's not so keen on carbs at the moment, so no potatoes for you, Jenny. But it's mild, it's silly, it's not, but it's respecting what Jenny has said about her not liking heavy food, for example. Or Jenny, I understand Jenny's got a sweet tooth. Let's make sure we save enough pudding for her, and so on. So it's about bringing her into the conversation, and the common knowledge that you've built, it mediates that. Another very, very, sorry, and then what happens next is that then one hopes that through that, it will become very much more normal that the child can, that Jenny can actually engage in the meal, can be involved in the preparation, can feel agentically engaged with her tiny bit of support for what matters in the family. Again, another example about staying out late. And so the foster parent believes in being firm but fair to create a safe environment. Jenny wants to stay out late with her friends. She doesn't trust adults, so her friends are very important. And all the research shows that friends are really important for children going through this. And again, need to build common knowledge by doing activities together, maybe taking the dog for a walk, but moving on to actually allow her to find the solution, Jenny, to find the solution to the problem by, for example, inviting her friends around, feeding them hot dogs and non-alcoholic drinks. So when I did that with my children, they used to love the fact that they would bring in a bit of vodka and under their coats. But anyway, but it's just using the common knowledge as a way of mediating the way in which you create rules for the child, and over time allow them to take control over that. A more complicated version of this is when thinking about how practitioners work together, or how foster parents work with practitioners. And I've taken the example of school rather than social work, but I mean, we could think about that in terms of social work. But the child is finding it difficult to settle in school, so that's the problem that's been worked on. The foster parent will talk to the teacher about the need to work slowly to build trust, but be aware that why the teacher's being so ratty, it's because the exams are coming up and she's under a huge amount of pressure. And so the common knowledge is built between the foster parent and the teacher, but crucially important, the child is brought in to the discussion. So what matters for her or him is also part of that common knowledge. And then again, we get to the situation where we negotiate a solution, and the child needs to be part of that solution. And that solution might be that she or he doesn't take all the exams, or doesn't take any of the exams, or chooses which exams they're going to do. But all the time, it's about understanding the motive orientations in relation to the problem. But I think in terms of the first few days of entry into placement, the real effort needs to be going on the very first kind of example that I was talking about the sort of settling into the home. Working with friends becomes a bit later, and so does building that capacity around schools. So the 3 gardening tools that I've been talking about are about growing a relational bond of trust. So relational expertise involves recognizing the standpoints and motive orientations of others. That, what's enlisted there, consists of what matters to each person is the common knowledge. It consists of what matters to each person, their motive orientations, and then that becomes a resource to be used when working relationally, and it can mediate transitions. And relational agency can help sustain and grow the agency of the child or young person so that the transition is developmental, and there is the developmental coupling kind of accommodation going on. So why is relational agency so important? Well, I think it's evidence of the relational bond of trust, the fact that the child will work jointly with an adult over time, but will also be able to move forward and act responsibly and agentically themselves. So it gradually supports the development of responsibility. And it's very much based in efforts at mutual understanding of the child and their histories, and ensuring that those are taken seriously. And over time, as I said, the adult's role reduces to avoid dependency. So I'm coming towards the end, the beginning of the end. And just a reflection, here's Vygotsky. He died when he was in his mid-30s, died very young. But for him, he's a good person to go to when you're thinking about learning and development, because of the importance he placed on emotion. And so just from something he wrote that's been more recently translated, the emotional experience, the Russian word perechivanie, arising from any situation or from any aspect of environment determines what kind of influence this situation or this environment will have on the child. So this thing about experience is an emotional experience. Therefore, it's not any of the factors themselves which determine how they would influence the future course of development, but the same factors refracted through the prism of the child's emotional experience. And that means we really need to understand that emotional experience, their motive orientations, how they have arisen, what they are leading the child towards. So second shameless book plug, implications for carers and practitioners. So relational expertise, building common knowledge, and supporting the unfolding of relational agency is something that can be learnt, not only by foster carers and practitioners related to placements, but I mean it is something that can be learnt as seen as important. That means we need to think about the child's motive orientations and why they're orienting in that way. We need to think about the origins of those motive orientations. We need to try and see the world through their eyes. So what are they interpreting as the demands of that setting? And to what extent can we work relationally with them in order to support their development as agentic, towards being agentic young people in control of their own lives. Now, I'm going to conclude by saying I've been quite frustrated in not being able to take these concepts into care settings in order to really test them. They've been tested in settings that are very close to these kind of care placements, but not actually in care placements within a system. And I retired before I could do that through the Recenter. So if anybody is interested in maybe a master's student or a PhD student, or indeed themselves, trying out these ideas in care settings, I would be utterly delighted and would be very happy to support in whatever way I can. So I'm going to end there, and I could see some people raising hands. So I suspect 42 mentions in chat. I'm going to hand back, I think, to Melanie. Who's going to take over. Shall I stop screen sharing?
Sure. Thank you, Anne. Thank you so much, Dr. Edwards, for that presentation. I think before we go to the, excuse me, the Q&A, we'll go to Marie Christian for her presentation, and then we'll open up to conversation after. Marie, are you ready?
I'm ready. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much.
Hello, everybody. It's so great to be with you here today. Thank you, Dr. Edwards, for that really great information. And it really, a few things that you said really resonated with my experience here at the Youth in Care Network. So I look forward to seeing how parts of our presentations might align and support one another. I'll just share my screen. There. I'm hoping everyone has the presentation view.
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. All right, so as was mentioned during the introductions, my name is Marie Christian. I'm the Director of Voices, Manitoba's Youth in Care Network. And we are a network of young people in and from care, specifically 12-ish to 30-ish from throughout the province. And our role as a network is to engage, equip, and empower young people. And by that I mean engage, we want them to know that they have a community of other young people who've been there and who get it. We want them to know that they're not alone in their experience of being in care, even though everyone's experience is different and is unique. They're not alone. There are some things that we share that helps to create a culture of being in care. Once young people are engaged and involved in the network, we want them to feel equipped. So whether it's through our rights workshops and our advocacy workshops, or any of the other resources and supports we can find and connect them to in our community, we want young people to have as many tools in their toolkit and in their bundle as possible. And empower. We use this word empower, but only for lack of words in the English language, because we believe that young people have the power all along. And they just, due to circumstance, due to just the way the world runs, and due to their experiences in care, they may not have known exactly how powerful they truly are. So we want to give them the opportunity to know the power of their voice and their ability to help create a better system of care. And we do that by going right back to the beginning, engaging, building community, sharing our stories, because together our stories are powerful and help to influence policy in positive and meaningful ways. I myself am an alumni of CARE. I am very honored and appreciative to have been born and raised here on Treaty 1 territory, Winnipeg, Manitoba. I'm very, very honored to, as was mentioned during the introductions, to be one of the students in the MSW based in Indigenous Knowledges program through the University of Manitoba. It has been an incredible year, a tough year, a COVID year of learning and growing. But it was so important because although I grew up in Manitoba and was aware of many of the challenges that are faced by Indigenous communities, taking this time to really dig deep and learn more of the intricacies just helps me to be a better helper, especially when it comes to working with youth in care, who I'm sure you might know, but statistically here in Manitoba, 90% of the young people in care are Indigenous and First Nations. So thank you to the MSW IK program for giving me this opportunity to learn. So, sorry, I set a reminder for myself and here you go. I today will be talking about transitions from care from a youth and care perspective. And I want to focus on sharing some of the stories of young people who've transitioned from care. And of course, there are so many stories and every transition process is unique, but I'll share a few of them. And then I want to share with you from the Youth in Care Network perspective, what do we recommend? What are we asking for? And then finally, what are some ways that members of the community can be supports to young people as they transition from care? So first story, Shante, not her real name, was 18 years old. She moved into her apartment 6 months earlier and was just starting to feel settled. It had been hard at first, moving from her group home that was always filled with other girls, the sound of fighting or laughter filling the hallways, to her little space that was always quiet, except for thumps from the footsteps of the neighbors above her or squeaks from the old radiator. But she was starting to settle in. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was her landlord coming to ask her when she'd be paying her rent. She was surprised. Her rent was always paid directly from the agency to her landlord. Thinking back, Shantae realized she had not seen her worker for a few months. She gave her agency a call, and she was surprised and dismayed to be informed that she was no longer a ward of her Child and Family Services agency. She was now responsible for paying her own rent and living expenses. She had to find her own way. Within 2 months, Shantae was couch surfing, her belongings packed in boxes and garbage bags and stowed in someone's garage to wait for her until she could find a new place. Despite her best efforts to be successful in school and to find a part-time job to support herself, Shantae continuously struggled, eventually falling into addictions and never truly finding stability. Education had been a priority for Shantae, a goal instilled in her by a former foster mom and the staff at the community center she would attend as a child. But despite numerous attempts to attain her GED in different adult learning centers, she has so far been unable to find the stability in her life that would allow her to focus on her education. Her reading comprehension and writing skills were not at the level she would like them to be at, because her English is not her first language. Cree is. It took Shantae many years to tell her supports about the language barrier she was experiencing. Samuel, not his real name, grew up in care for most of his life. He lives with mental health challenges and can be difficult to work with. 2 weeks before his 18th birthday, he told the staff at the community center where he went for his meals that his time in care would be ending soon. Knowing that Samuel was a permanent ward, the staff member called his social worker and asked what the plan of care was for Samuel, if he had been offered an AYA, agreement with young adults. The worker was not supportive of an application for an AYA. The staff member arranged a meeting with the worker, the supervisor, and other supports from the community that worked with Samuel. In the end, the agency refused to offer Samuel an AYA, stating that they had connected him to adult disability services and he would have to learn to work with them. A few weeks later, that staff member spotted Samuel in the community. He didn't look well. The staff member approached him and Samuel expressed the difficulty he was having with accessing the adult supports. He no longer had his meds and he wasn't feeling well. The staff member waited with Samuel at the local walk-in clinic and afterwards purchased him a meal. The staff member gave Samuel his phone number and told him to call the next day so they could work together to find him more resources and get him connected to adult services. Samuel didn't call, and the worker has no idea where he might be today. One more story. Miles, not his real name. Miles came into care at age 14 after his friend's parents caught him sleeping in their garage. He had been living on the streets for some time already and had figured out how to stay safe by sleeping in garages and in the bushes of parks in the more rich areas of the city. His friend's parents contacted CFS and became his foster parents, treating him as their own son. After completing high school, he went on to university and then continued on to graduate studies. Over time, he maintained his employment, married his partner, and together they grew a family. Miles flourished in an environment that provided stability, meaningful relationships, and community. He was given the time to heal and to explore his identity. His 18th birthday came and went, celebrated in the same way that his foster parents celebrated their bio kids. He wasn't forced to pack his bags or to prove why and how he would benefit from more time with extended support and services. Miles was simply given time to grow. These are only 3 stories of transitions from care. For every young person who ages out, there's a different variation depending on so many variables, from external supports to internal resilience. But one thing remains the same: the impending sense of doom at the approaching of one's 18th birthday. So when young people age out of care, the overall experience is lonely and isolating. Going from a situation where most major and minor decisions are made on their behalf by foster parents, social workers, or group home staff, suddenly young people find themselves positioned to make very important decisions on their own. In general, young people today continue to rely on their social support networks, including their parents, friends, and communities throughout their adult lives. And that was from an article written by Dr. Melanie Doucette, also an alumni of CARE. Youth aging out of care are deprived of this social support network, and the outcomes have been well documented. Youth aging out of care in Canada are up to 200 times more likely to experience homelessness than their peers who are not in care, with Indigenous and LGBTQ2S+ youth experiencing an even higher risk. As in Shantae's story, many young people age out of care and are no longer able to afford the rental costs of their independent living placement due to challenges securing or maintaining stable employment or accessing financial support through adult services. The majority of youth who age out of care live in poverty. And that's from a report written by Jane Kovarakova, also an alumni of CARE. And these young people struggle to balance financial responsibilities with limited financial resources. Secure, stable housing, financial resources, and education are only 3 of the challenges young people face as they age out of care. Health and mental health resources are also limited. The child welfare system is a not so distant cousin of the colonial practices of residential schools and the 60s scoop. Implements that were created for the assimilation of Indigenous peoples into mainstream culture. First Nations children have higher rates of involvement with child and family services, including apprehensions compared to all other children in Manitoba. Close to 1/3 of all First Nations children in Manitoba spend some time in the care of child and family services during their childhood. That's from the Manitoba Advocate Report this year, 2021. This higher rate of child welfare involvement reflects the larger structural inequalities, systemic racism, and current child welfare policies, and the legacy of the residential school system in 60s scoop. While there is increased awareness and understanding of the colonial structure that undergirds the child welfare system and attempts to improve legislation and policies, the child welfare system remains rooted in the colonial structures that ensure the continuation of structural inequalities and systemic racism. It will take intentional, drastic changes to create a system that is truly centered on the well-being of children, youth, and their families. Samuel's story illustrates the difficulty many young people who age out of care face when they don't have the support that they need to maintain a continuity of services and supports. And in this case, especially, continuity of simple things like medication, well, simple as quotes, medication that would help this young person stay in a healthy state of mind. When young people age out of care, the health and mental health supports that they have come to rely on are immediately withdrawn. His story also speaks to inconsistency of practice policy. In the absence of consistent practice policy, individual case planning decisions continue to be at the discretion of the caseworker and supervisor to determine whether a youth will be involved in developing a transition plan or eligible for an extension of care. The decision for an extension of care is left to the discretion of the worker, and far too often, the relationship between the young person and their agency can tip the balance on whether or not that young person will be offered an extension of support. For Indigenous youth aging out of care, issues of homelessness, financial stress, education attainment, health and mental health supports and resources, and other challenges that many youth aging out of care experience are compounded by the colonial experience of being separated from their land, their community, and their family. Most Indigenous youth expressed a sense of loss and grief due to experiencing multiple layers of intergenerational displacement and trauma through the removal of their communities of origin and simultaneous separation from their siblings. The removal from their communities of origin also impacted their ability to form cultural connections to the land. Living in relationship with the land is foundation of much of Indigenous self-identity. And there are so many challenges Indigenous youth in care face, such as loss of identity, loss of culture, broken family structure, attachment disorder, multiple placements, which result in lack of trust and meaningful relationships. Without intentional and meaningful restructuring of the child welfare system, children and youth, particularly Indigenous children and youth, will continue to bear the burden of colonialism. And the bleak reality is the government inaction and its ongoing violations of the rights of Indigenous youth and children has resulted in harms and the high mortality rates. The ongoing violation of their rights will continue to perpetuate harms and lead to loss. As of March 2020, there were 9,849 children and youth in care in Manitoba, the highest per capita across Canada. Of those numbers, 90% are First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. And of all the children in care, 70% are permanent wards, 3% are under a voluntary placement, and the remaining 27% are children in care under a temporary legal status where reunification with family is a primary goal. The legal status of kids in care impacts the supports and the services that they'll be eligible to receive once they reach the age of majority. Every year, hundreds of young people age out of the CFS system in Manitoba because they reach the age of majority. And in Manitoba, the age of majority is 18 years old. As of March 2020, the government of Manitoba reported that 811 young people were on extensions of care, or AYAs, a provision that extends care and support services for young people who are permanent wards of CFS until they reach 21 years old. If a young person reaches the age of majority without becoming a permanent ward of CFS, their options for support after aging care are limited. One thing that they're not offered is an AYA. In Manitoba, our child welfare system is divided into 4 authorities in the hopes of providing culturally appropriate care. Each authority is governed by the Child and Family Services Act and the Regulations Manual, but while Child and Family Services legislation provides the mandate for services to youth aging out of care, the legislation does not place specific duties upon authorities and agencies to ensure that youth leave care in circumstances that will ensure positive outcomes for them. There are many kind and compassionate workers doing their best to create supports and trainings that may benefit young people as they transition from care, but there is no consistency across the authorities and no reporting or accountability required for the services they provide. In the absence of consistent practice policies and standards, case planning decisions are often left to the discretion of the caseworkers and supervisors to determine the level of transition planning that will be offered to the young people leaving care. Changing from the current practice of requiring young people to apply for an AYA to automatically transitioning them to extended supports and services would remove the option or the power of the caseworker to not offer a young person an extension of care, and instead require them to cultivate a relationship with that young person or connect that young person to someone who can be a meaningful person in their lives. The current policies that address preparing young people for transitioning from care and aftercare supports are found in the CFS Act and the CFS Service Manual. And as I mentioned, it's very discretionary. And as I also mentioned earlier, all of the services that are offered do not extend to all kids in care, only permanent wards. Young people who are on VPA or temporary do not receive the same extension of services. Essentially, Section 50 point 2 of the CFS Act states, the director or the agency with the approval of the director may continue to provide care and maintenance for a former permanent ward for the purpose of assisting the ward to complete transition to independence, but not beyond the date when the former permanent ward attains 21 years. So essentially, to me, that means the director of child welfare could make the decision today that young people in care do not need to watch with a wary eye for their 18th birthday, and could instead pour that energy into participating in things that will help them get to a place of readiness. It's important to note that this legislation only applies to young people who are permanent wards. The remaining 30% of young people in care under temporary guardianship can be made permanent wards and be provided extensions of care, but it is again up to the discretion of the director and the caseworkers. Youth in care under temporary orders and voluntary placement agreements represent a significant portion of the total youth in care group from age 15 to 17. These young people should also be able to complete their education and receive support until they are ready to transition from care. And that was from a report by Alice McEwen Morrison in 2012. I'm noticing the time, so I'm going to skip forward a little bit. I just want to point out, though, that while there are no consistent policies here in Manitoba, it's also true across our country. Care leaving is a transnational and global challenge in relation to social policy, legislation, and services in supporting transitions to adulthood from care. Every country in the world arranges its child welfare system in its own way. The differences between countries in relation to legal and social regulations are enormous. Some have well-developed legislation, while others have none. In Canada, each province has its own jurisdiction over child welfare, and transition services vary greatly. There is currently no federal or jurisdictional legislative framework for the provision of transition supports and services, and data collecting and reporting within and across jurisdictions is lacking. Canada is one of the very few Western countries that does not have a national legislation or standards supporting the transition for adulthood for youth from care. So how do youth and care networks help? We help by building community. As I mentioned earlier, we start with letting young people know that they're not alone in this experience, even though their experience is their own. And we share our stories to help create a better system of care, whether that's at a systemic level or whether it's one another. We really encourage young people to participate in peer mentorship and peer support, and not by necessarily signing them up to be a peer mentor or support, but because they are part of community, it happens naturally and organically. Also, there's no age cutoff. So on paper, yes, Voices is for age 12 to age 30. But if you were to come hang out with us at Christmas, we have Voices Family Christmas Party on Christmas Day for young people who've transitioned from care. And sometimes we have our older alumni who are past the age of 30, but who consider this their family tradition. They consider Voices their family of choice. There's no cutoff. As long as you need the network and you need that connection, we're here for you. Connecting young people to resources. We get a lot of phone calls, both within Winnipeg and throughout the province, of foster families who need some support finding resources for their young person who's about to transition from care, or from young people who are turning 18 pretty soon and they haven't had a good conversation with their worker yet as to what is available to them and what is an option for them. So we help young people connect to resources that exist already in the community. And advocacy, like I mentioned a few times already, by coming together, our voice is stronger. And when we have that strong voice, we can advocate with and for young people at a systemic level, but also at an individual level. Sometimes young people need us to stand in front of them and speak on their behalf. Sometimes they just need us to stand at their side and be there to gently nudge them to speak for themselves. And sometimes they just need us there as backup to cheer them on and to check in with them afterwards. But we want to help young people know the power of their voice. It's getting late, so I will skip this digital story, but if you ever want to watch this or any other digital story made by alumni of CARE sharing about their experience, please visit our YouTube page. So these are the systemic changes that we are advocating for. First, we're advocating that the system adopt a readiness-based practice instead of the current age-based process. 18 is an arbitrary number. 21 is also arbitrary. When we learn about and when we talk about brain development and social development, everything happens when it needs to happen. So we are saying rather than just having an arbitrary cutoff, which induces a lot of stress on the young person to be ready, what if we just focused on making sure they're ready? And when a young person is ready, they will move forward. We're also advocating for an extension of support and services to all young people in care, regardless of their care status. And as I read earlier, according to the CFS manual, the director of CFS has the power to just say, okay, you can have support and services. And then, you know, it kind of along the lines of what Dr. Edwards was talking about earlier, it's so important to involve young people in the creation, development, and the refining of their plan of care. And I add refining, excuse me, because the plan that they make when they're 15, which is when their worker is supposed to sit down and start the conversation about transitions from care, the plan that they made when they're 15 might change a few times between 15 and 21, and that shouldn't be held against them. Young people should have the opportunity to fail forward, to try things and to realize it did or didn't work, and then to readjust their plan without fear of, oh, I messed up, they're going to kick me out, I'm not going to be able to stay in care or finish school or live my life. Let's just get rid of that stress. It's unnecessary. Individuals, everyone in community, everywhere across Manitoba, what we can do, listen. So as a Youth in Care Network, we always say ask, listen, believe, and act. Ask a young person what is happening in their life, what are their thoughts about transitioning from care, what are some of the things that they have as goals for their own life. Listen to them. We are blessed with 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Believe what they say and then act on it. If they need support, if they just need a gentle reminder every once in a while, ask them how you can be an active participant and support in their lives. Develop supportive relationships. Give positive feedback. Educate and advocate for youth rights. If you haven't already, take a look at the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And then insist on resources to be able to provide quality care. Now, this is something we definitely need our adult allies to do because young people under 18 can't vote, but you can vote. So when it comes time to hold our government and our officials and our policymakers accountable, please do ask at least one question about youth in care. So that is where I will leave off for today. If you have any questions or if you want the citate or the reference for what I was sharing today, just let me know. You can reach out to us at the Youth in Care Network. There's our website, there's our phone numbers, and there's our social media. We're just look for voices. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Marie, and thank you. And I appreciate so much you both being here today with us. and for the messages of research and inspiration that you're both able to share with us today. So thank you so much. We don't have a ton of time left, but there are a few questions and accolades that I'd like to share with you. There are lots of thanks and congratulations in the chat. And specifically for you, Marie, folks, just grateful for the work that you do in regards to your advocacy. So thank you for that. And also to Anne for your research and the ways in which you're conceptualizing your work in supporting kids in care. Maybe we'll move to a few questions. One that's come up in a couple of different ways in the Q&A, and I just want to remind participants who are here with us from far and wide, by the way. I was looking through the list of names. We've got folks from all over Manitoba and Canada, including teachers, principals, superintendents, other researchers. So just welcome again to all of you, and thank you for joining us. And this is a question for you that's come up a couple of times, and it's about this balance of not enough attachment and too much attachment. It's come up a number of times in the Q&A, and I'm wondering if you could just speak a little bit more to that concept that you were presenting with us, that you presented us with earlier.
Okay, it first occurred to me when I was doing observations in preschools, in nursery schools, that there is, I could take the feminist angle on this, but I won't. I'll take the more sort of psychological angle on it. But if you're working professionally with vulnerable people, you really don't want to create their dependency on you. What you need to be doing is empowering them in order to do the kinds of things that Marie was talking about, being able to take themselves forward. So if we think about foster care, working in a care setting, my argument is that it would be quite self-indulgent for the adults to build those kind of very strong affective relationships with young people. And there's a need for some kind of professional distancing. That isn't a distancing that means that you're not caring. It doesn't mean that you're not taking them seriously. In fact, it does mean you're caring and taking them seriously. And you are working professionally with them. Again, those of you working in social work will know all too well about this, that those social workers who build up dependency relationships and their caseloads are up here somewhere and they're not able to give good help. So those concepts, the three concepts, are very much about taking people seriously, about respecting them, about caring about them, about having their best interests at heart. But at the same time, I would like people who are involved in doing that care work to be able to analyze what they're doing in the way that you don't necessarily do as a parent or a grandparent, but to think about it slightly more professionally. And that's what I mean.
Yeah, it makes me think about sort of an infantilization or a deficit-oriented approach to young people, absolutely, versus an empowering and an agentic way of working with young people. And Marie spoke quite a bit about this, as did you, Anne, in regards to having young people being able to make decisions about themselves and their care plans, transitions, and different kinds of decision-making involvement when there are decisions being made about them. I'm wondering, Marie, if you wanted to add on to that, if there are any thoughts that you have in that regard to the ways in which we might conceptualize our work with young people.
Well, specifically in regards to, I made a note of it earlier. Oh no, I didn't. I think the question was about the attachments, not attaching. Okay. When I heard you say that, and I'd have to dig into it a little bit more just to clarify my thoughts, but what came to mind was this was advice from other young people who came from care. Yeah. So they might have been speaking out of their own hurt or out of their own experiences. And so they're giving a gentle nudge to a younger person, like, these relationships are going to end, so don't get too attached. But from a system perspective, or from an adult ally perspective, I would encourage that we offer as many opportunities as possible to young people to make healthy attachments that won't end based on their care status. while they're in care, yeah, kids might be moved to a different foster home. They might be moved into kinship care. They might be moved to independent living. And so those relationships will change. But if we can teach young people and give them opportunities to make relationships that will last regardless of their time in care or their age, then they will learn that healthy attachment is okay. And also relationship changing is okay, but there will always be people in your corner. So that was just the thought that came to mind when you initially heard said that, but I would like to kind of learn more about just the thought and idea behind it.
I think this notion of having somebody in your corner is really important. And so, and I certainly would utterly agree with you that that's important. Yeah.
Yeah, it is incredibly important. We often talk about the power of one, you know, at least having one person in your life who you know you can count on no matter what is so important.
I'm mindful of the time, so I'll perhaps ask one more question. Both of you focused quite a bit on, in your talk, on transitions and transition in relation to out of care or familial placements. I'm wondering if you have any last insights for us in regards to your thoughts on transitions and school transition. I just see that there's quite a few educators here in our audience, and I'm wondering how some of your thoughts or insights might translate into the experiences that that youth in care have, or children in care have, when they're transitioning between school placements. Any thoughts there? Maybe we'll start with you, Anne.
Yeah, it's massive, isn't it? In particular, it's in elementary school, it's probably a lot easier because children tend to have a relationship with one teacher, and schools are usually well equipped for thinking about good preventative care for children. So it would be that there's often quite a family feel to elementary schools. So other teachers are also looking out for the children who are particularly vulnerable. Secondary school is really so much more difficult. I mean, I can't, because I don't know the Canadian system, but certainly within the UK, schools do have strong pastoral teams, and so the thing to do would be to be working with the pastoral team. If the child is particularly vulnerable, then we have a system called Team Around a Child, which would be professionals who would be dealing if the child's got mental health issues, or in addition to their other problems. So this transition is, it's a long answer, but the parents the carers, the foster parents need to be working with the pastoral teams in order to build up an understanding of the child and what the child has come from, and where the child is now in terms of their transitions to the home, because the transition to the home has got to be worked on first. And the child also needs to be involved in some of those discussions so that they see that they have a voice, that they all the things that Marie was saying, actually, that they can develop some kind of control over their own trajectories as they move into school. But the care home and the pastoral team in the UK setting would be the first step.
Thanks, Anne. Marie, any insights from you in regards to transitions for young people in schools?
Ooh, okay. Yeah, so specifically transitioning out of care, or just transitioning placement bouncing?
Yeah, I was thinking more transitions between schools as they remain in care, but often are changing placements, which means often changing schools.
Mm-hmm. I know that that's a huge challenge. You know, many of the young people that we've interacted with, when they've been moved from one placement to another, sometimes they're not able to continue in school, maybe because of the time of the school year, or because the school just feels like they haven't had the opportunity to prepare the resources and supports they think the student might need. I can't speak from a system perspective. There might be things that I don't understand or recognize, but from a lived experience perspective, I think it's important to just allow the young person to be in school and sort out the details as they arise. kind of like a Jordan's principle for school. Let the child be in school and let them start making those connections as often as possible. I think it's important to allow young people to stay in the same school, but I recognize that when young people are moving from urban to rural or vice versa, then that's just physically impossible. So as much as possible, allowing young people to stay in the same school, but if they cannot stay in the same school, allow them to start school right away and work out the details as they emerge.
Yeah, thank you. That's quite insightful. Thanks, Marie. I'm just mindful of the time and just want to thank everyone for being here today. Special thanks again to Dr. Ann Edwards and Marie Christian, Executive Director of Voices, the Youth Advocacy Network here in Winnipeg, Manitoba. A reminder to all of our participants here today to check out our website, equityforkidsincare.net. We have one last webinar coming up in this series on December 8th, and it's entitled School-Based Successes, Stories of Hope. Dr. Marlon Bennett will be one of our presenters from the University of Manitoba, as well as Amy Comas, one of our collaborators from Seven Oaks School Division. They'll both be presenting that day for us. I'll be hosting you, I believe, that day. I'd also like to just have a special shout out to Huang Kao, our research assistant, who's been helping us with the organization. Thank you, Huang. Also to Dr. Kathy Levine and Dr. Dawn Sutherland for organizing and supporting these Connections grants and webinars. And of course to Shirk, our Connections grant funder. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Anne and Marie. It's been such a pleasure. And guests, all of our webinars are posted online at our website. So we hope that you do check it out. Thanks everyone for being here. We'll see you on December the 8th.
Thank you so much, Melanie. Bye.
Bye.
Oh,
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
thank you.
Bye.
Bye.